My name is Iris Brecker. I'm 29 years old. And on a Wednesday night in February, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Denver, Colorado, finishing a glass of wine and answering work emails, when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in 8 years. I didn't answer. Then it called again. And again. By the time I woke up the next morning, I had 31 missed calls, all from my sister Cara, and a voicemail that started with 3 words that weren't, "I am sorry." I want you to stay with me through this entire story because the ending is not what you think it is. And if you've ever been the person your family treated like a problem to solve instead of a person to love, I think you're going to feel every single word of this. Before I get into those 31 calls and what was behind them, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you've ever sat alone in a new city wondering whether cutting people off makes you the villain or the survivor, please subscribe. Because this community is built for exactly that conversation, and I'm not going anywhere. Now let me take you back. Not to the night of the calls. Not yet. Let me take you back 8 years to Harlins Creek, Kentucky, population just under 6,000, the kind of town where the same families have owned the same businesses for 3 generations and everybody eats at the same diner on Sunday morning after the same church service. I grew up on Birchwood Lane in a yellow house with a broken porch step that my father swore he would fix every single spring and never did. I grew up in that house with my mother Marlene, my father Doug, my older sister Cara, and my younger brother Tate. And from the outside, the Breckers looked like exactly what Harlins Creek expected them to be. Church-going, flag-waving, casserole-bringing, show-up-to-every-school event kind of family. From the inside it was something else entirely. I need you to understand something about Marlene Brecker before I go any further, because if you don't understand her, none of what I'm about to tell you will make sense. My mother is not a loud woman. She doesn't scream, she doesn't throw things, she doesn't make scenes in grocery store parking lots. What she does is quieter and more precise than that. Marlene operates through disappointment. Through the sigh that comes just a half second too long after you share good news. Through the way she'll say, "That's nice, honey," while looking just slightly past your shoulder at something more interesting. Through the phone calls to relatives that always seem to happen right after you'd done something she disagreed with. Calls you were never told about but always somehow found out about later. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn a version of my mother's approval that she had already decided I wasn't going to get. I just didn't know that yet. Cara was the one who got it. 3 years older, effortlessly pretty, the kind of girl who made honor roll without appearing to study and had a laugh that made adults turn their heads in rooms. Marlene lit up around Cara in a way I can only describe as visibly different from how she was around me. It wasn't hatred toward me. I want to be careful about that because what my mother felt toward me wasn't hatred. It was something colder. Indifference dressed up as concern. She paid attention to me the way you pay attention to a warning light on a dashboard, not because you're invested in it but because you're waiting to see if it goes away on its own. Tate, my younger brother, was 12 when everything broke. He was largely insulated from the dynamics between Cara and me and Marlene, mostly because Tate had the survival instinct to stay invisible. He played video games in his room, kept his opinions to himself and moved through our house like a ghost with a game controller. I loved him for it. I still do. But back then I envied the peace of his particular invisibility because mine never came that easy. The night that ended everything for me was not dramatic in the way you might expect. It was a Tuesday in October and I was 21 years old, sitting at the same kitchen table where Marlene had fed us breakfast every morning for my entire life. I had driven home from Lexington where I was finishing my last year of a communications degree at a state school I'd gotten myself into and was paying for myself through a combination of scholarships, a part-time job at a copy center, and a small private student loan I'd taken out in my own name. My parents had contributed nothing to my education. Not because they couldn't. My father had a steady income managing inventory at a regional hardware distributor. They had a savings account. The money existed. It just wasn't designated for me. Cara had gotten 2 years of community college paid for in full. Every textbook, every fee, every semester. When I'd asked before I applied anywhere whether there was any money set aside for my education too, Marlene had tilted her head and said, "Iris, you've always been so independent. We figured you'd want to do it your own way." I was 18 years old and I'd never once said I wanted to do anything on my own. That was the first time I understood that the story my mother was telling about me had nothing to do with who I actually was. But I let it go. I enrolled, I worked, I borrowed, and I managed. That October Tuesday I came home because I needed a signature. My loan servicer required a parent cosigner for a refinancing arrangement that would have dropped my interest rate by nearly 2 full points over the remaining term. It was a practical visit. A one-signature favor. I sat down at the kitchen table and explained the paperwork clearly. Marlene listened with her hands folded. Doug sat beside her, quiet in the way he was always quiet when Marlene was the one speaking without saying a word. I finished explaining. The room was silent for a moment. Then Marlene looked at Doug and then looked back at me. "Iris," she said, and her voice had that particular gentleness she reserved for delivering conclusions she'd already reached before you walked in the room. "Your father and I talked about this, and we don't think it's a good idea for us to be financially tied to your decisions. You're very capable. You've always figured things out." I stared at her. I asked if Kara had ever needed a cosigner for anything. Doug looked at the table. Marlene said that was a completely different situation. Asked how. She said she didn't want to argue. I said I wasn't arguing, I was asking a question. She said I was being confrontational. I said I was being direct. And that was when Kara walked in from the hallway. I don't know how long she'd been standing there. Long enough, I think, because she walked in with the specific energy of someone who had already chosen a side before hearing the argument. She said, "Mom's just trying to protect the family financially, Iris. You know how you get. You know how you get." I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. Said at dinner tables, said at holiday gatherings, said in hushed tones on phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear. You know how Iris gets. As if I were a weather system. As if the problem was the atmospheric pressure I created rather than the environment I was reacting to. I asked Kara what exactly she meant by that. She looked at Marlene instead of at me. That look, that single sideways look that communicated an entire shared language I'd never been given access to, was the thing that finally snapped something clean in two inside me. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood up from the table, picked up my paperwork, and said very clearly that I understood and that I would handle it myself the way I apparently always had. Marlene called after me as I walked toward the stairs. She said I was being dramatic. She said I always did this. I heard Doug clear his throat. I heard Kara say something I couldn't make out. I went upstairs, packed a bag with enough for a week, and I left Harlan's Creek that same night. I drove back to Lexington with my windows down in October cold because I needed the air on my face to keep me from turning around. I didn't turn around. And when I got back to my apartment and sat on the edge of my bed at 1 in the morning, I made a decision that I kept for 8 years. I was done. Not loud. Not dramatic. Done in the quiet, settled way that happens when you finally run out of something you didn't realize was finite. The thing that was finite, it turned out, was my willingness to be a person my family only noticed when I was causing them a problem. I changed my number the following week. I didn't send a letter, didn't post anything, didn't make an announcement. I just went quiet. And for 8 years Harlan's Creek and everyone on Birchwood Lane went on without me. The question is what happened the night my sister finally called 31 times. I had built something in those 8 years. Something real, something mine, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, late night by early morning. I want you to know that before we go any further because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand what I was protecting when those calls came through. Nobody in Harlan's Creek knew where I went. That was intentional. I didn't leave a forwarding address, didn't tell my college friends which direction I was heading, didn't post a single thing online that would give anyone a trail to follow. I finished my degree in December, walked across the stage at a ceremony where nobody from my family was sitting in the audience, and 3 weeks later I loaded everything I owned into a second-hand Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the passenger side, and I drove west. Not because I had a plan waiting for me somewhere. Because west was the direction that felt the most like a way. I ended up in Denver by accident, honestly. I had a loose contact. A former classmate named Britt who'd mentioned once that she had a spare room and was looking for someone to split rent. I called her from a rest stop in Missouri, asked if the offer was still open, and she said yes without asking why I was calling from a number she didn't recognize. That was the first time a near stranger extended me more grace than my own family ever had, and it wouldn't be the last. I moved in on a Saturday in January with 2 duffel bags, a box of books, and exactly $340 in my checking account. Denver was gray and cold and enormous, and I didn't know a single soul in it beyond Britt, and I have never in my life felt more free. The first year was brutal in the specific way that starting over is always brutal when you're doing it without a safety net. I found a job within 2 weeks, a front desk position at a mid-sized marketing agency called Callaway Group, answering phones and managing the scheduling system for a team of about 15 people. It paid just enough to cover my share of the rent and groceries if I was careful, and I was extraordinarily careful. I ate a lot of rice and a lot of eggs. I walked to work when the weather allowed it to save on gas. I didn't buy anything that wasn't strictly necessary, and I defined necessary very narrowly. Some evenings I sat in Brit's kitchen and did freelance copywriting work for small businesses I found through an online platform, charging $40 for blog posts that took me 2 hours to write. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and that distinction meant everything. What nobody tells you about going no contact is the administrative burden of it. Every form that asks for an emergency contact. Every medical intake that assumes someone is coming to pick you up. Every holiday that arrives on the calendar like a small quiet detonation. I wrote not applicable on so many lines during that first year that the letters stopped feeling like an abbreviation and started feeling like a name. I was the not applicable person. The one with no listed family, no hometown to mention, no Thanksgiving plans to discuss when coworkers made small talk in November. I built a careful, specific vagueness around my personal life and maintained it with the kind of discipline that only comes from years of practice at being someone nobody asked too many questions about. But something else happened in that first year too, something I didn't anticipate. I started to hear myself think. Not metaphorically. I mean that for the first time in my conscious memory, the internal voice in my head was just mine. Not a version of Marlene's commentary filtered through my own perception. Not a waiting, bracing sensation before I said anything in case it landed wrong. Just my own thoughts, arriving and departing without that low constant interference I hadn't even recognized as interference until it was gone. It was disorienting at first, like a sound you'd grown so used to you didn't realize it was noise until someone turned it off. By year 2 I had been promoted twice at Callaway Group, first to office manager and then to junior account coordinator. My supervisor, a woman named Diane Pratt who had built her career from a very similar starting point and had no patience whatsoever for people who couldn't back up their ambitions with actual output, told me at my 6-month review that I was the most organized person she had managed in 11 years and that if I enrolled in even one professional development course she would advocate for me to move into a full account role within the year. I enrolled in 3. Diane was not a warm person. She was better than warm. He was fair. And in my experience, fairness from someone in a position of power over you is rarer and more valuable than warmth by a significant margin. I moved into my own apartment at the start of year 3, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building in Capitol Hill with radiator heat and a window that looked out onto a street lined with old cottonwood trees. I bought a small second-hand couch, a kitchen table that wobbled until I figured out the right combination of folded cardboard under the short leg, and a lamp from an estate sale that cast the whole living room in warm amber light that made the space feel like something intentional rather than something temporary. I stood in the middle of that room on the first night and understood that I had never in my life had a space that was only answerable to me. No one could walk through that door without my permission. No one could sigh at the way I arranged the furniture. No one could make me feel like a guest in my own life. It sounds small. It was enormous. Brit and I stayed close even after I moved out. She was the first person in Denver I told anything real to, and she received it the way the best people receive difficult information. Quietly, without trying to solve it, without using it as currency later. I told her about Harlan's Creek over takeout one evening about 18 months after I'd arrived, and she listened to the whole thing and then said, "So you just left and never looked back?" And I said, "Pretty much." And she said, "Good." 2 letters. The most validating thing anyone had said to me in years. By year 5 I was a senior account manager at Callaway Group overseeing a client portfolio worth just over $2 million annually. I had a small team of 3 reporting to me, a health insurance plan that covered everything including dental and vision, a retirement account I contributed to every month, and a reputation in the office as the person who noticed problems before they became crises. I had also started running, partly for the physical benefit and partly because there is something about moving your body through space under your own power that quiets the parts of your brain that won't stop processing. I ran 4 days a week through Washington Park in the early mornings before the city woke up properly, and those hours became the scaffolding around which the rest of my days were built. I need to tell you about Marcus because Marcus matters to this story in a way that will become clear later. I met him at a half marathon in year 6. Not because either of us was particularly competitive, but because we both ended up at the same water station at mile 9 making the same joke about why we thought this was a good idea. He was a high school history teacher, 32, originally from Flagstaff, funny in the dry, understated way that sneaks up on you and then won't leave. We got coffee after the race, then dinner the following week, and somewhere in the months after that we became the kind of people who kept a spare key to each other's apartments and had a standing Tuesday night dinner routine that neither of us ever canceled unless something was genuinely on fire. When I finally told him about my family, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night with cold takeout between us, he listened all the way through without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That sounds exhausting to carry for so long. Not poor you. Not you should consider reaching out." Just the honest acknowledgement that it was heavy. I knew then that he was someone worth keeping. I had not Googled anyone from Harlan's Creek in 8 years. I want to be specific about that because people assume no contact means you spend your time monitoring the people you've left from a safe distance. I didn't want to know. Every time a thought about Birchwood Lane surfaced, I let it pass the way you let a notification go when you're busy with something that actually matters. They had their life. I had mine. The two things existed in separate containers, and I intended to keep it that way. Until a Wednesday in February, 6 days before my 30th birthday, when my phone lit up with a 606 area code. Eastern Kentucky. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the geography the way you recognize a smell from a house you grew up in. I let it ring out. It called again. I turned the phone face down and finished my wine. By 3 in the morning it had called 20 more times. By the time my alarm went off at 6, I was looking at 31 missed calls and 1 voicemail notification sitting at the bottom of my screen. I made a full pot of coffee before I pressed play. The voice was my sister Kara's. 8 years older, and she sounded it. And what she said in that voicemail was not an apology. But it also wasn't simply 2 words asking for something. It was worse than both of those things combined. I had spent 8 years becoming someone I actually recognized in the mirror. Someone with a career, an apartment, a person who loved her without conditions, and a life that fit the shape of who she actually was rather than the shape her family had decided she should be. And in 31 phone calls across one night, all of that was about to be tested in ways I hadn't prepared for, because you can armor yourself against the past, but you can't always predict the exact form it takes when it shows up at your door. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. I know because I checked the timestamp before I played it. The way you check the weather before stepping outside into something you already know is going to be unpleasant. Kara's voice came through the speaker flat and controlled in that particular way people sound when they've been crying recently and are trying very hard not to start again. She didn't say hello. She started mid-sentence, the way people do when they've been rehearsing something in their heads so long that the beginning has already happened before they open their mouth. She said that she knew I probably wasn't going to call back, and that she understood why, and that she wasn't calling to fight. She said Mom had been diagnosed 6 weeks ago. Breast cancer stage 2, caught during a routine screening that Marlene had only agreed to because her friend Janet had gone the month before and pressured her into it. She said the prognosis was manageable, that the doctors were cautiously optimistic, that surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out and chemo would follow. She said Doug had taken it badly, which I translated without effort to mean Doug had retreated completely and left Kara to manage everything alone, because that was the architecture of that family and a cancer diagnosis wasn't going to restructure it overnight. She said Tate was overseas on contract engineering work in South Korea and was trying to get emergency leave approved. And then after all of that, after 4 minutes of clinical updates delivered in the careful voice of someone holding themselves together with both hands, she said, "I don't know what I'm asking you for. I just didn't know who else to call." I sat with that for a long time. I poured a second cup of coffee I didn't drink and looked out the window at the February street below, bare cottonwood branches against a white sky, and I thought about the last time I had seen Marlene Brecker's face. The kitchen table in Harlan's Creek. The measured gentleness of her voice when she said I was very capable and had always figured things out, as if she were complimenting me rather than closing a door in my face. I didn't feel the thing people expect you to feel when you hear a parent is sick. I didn't feel relief that she was going to be okay. I didn't feel grief or fear or even that complicated pull of obligation I'd been bracing for since the first ring of that phone. What I felt was something quieter and more specific. The exhaustion of someone who has spent years building a clean, organized life and can now see the mess heading toward it from a distance. I called Marcus first. He picked up on the second ring, already awake because he had a first period class and was the kind of person who arrived everywhere 20 minutes early. I told him about the voicemail. He listened without interrupting. When I finished there was a short pause and then he said, "What do you need right now? Not what are you going to do? Not you should probably call her back. Just what do you need right now?" I told him I needed to think out loud for a few minutes. He said okay and let me do exactly that. I talked through it the way you work through a problem when the stakes are real and the variables are unclear. What was being asked of me? What it would cost? What happened either way? Marcus said at the end of it, "You don't owe anyone a particular response. But you're going to make the one you can live with, which means you already know what it is." He was right. I hate when he is right that efficiently. I called Britt next. She had known about Harlan's Creek from the beginning and had watched me build everything I had built with something close to sisterly investment. She was less diplomatic than Marcus. "Are you sure it's not a manipulation tactic?" she asked, which I appreciated because it was the question I had been circling without wanting to say out loud. I thought about it honestly. I didn't think it was. Kara had never been the calculating one. That was Marlene's specific skill set. Kara's particular failing was simpler and in some ways harder to forgive than calculation. Kara's failing was passivity. She wasn't cruel. She was compliant. She stood in doorways and looked at our mother instead of at me. And she did it not out of malice but out of the deep unthinking reflex of someone who had never once examined whose approval she was performing for. That was worse in the long run. Cruelty you can build a wall against. Passivity just keeps finding the gaps. I didn't call Kara back that day. I went to work, sat through 2 client calls and a team meeting, and ran 6 miles after work instead of 4 because I needed the extra distance to stop replaying the voicemail. That night I did something I hadn't done in 8 years. I typed Marlene Brecker into a search engine. There wasn't much. A church directory listing. A comment on a local community board from 3 years ago. A photograph in the background of a church fundraiser. Marlene standing near a folding table in a navy cardigan, looking smaller than I remembered her. Not smaller in stature. Smaller in the way people look when the story you've been carrying about them turns out to have been built at a scale the real person can't quite fill. I typed Kara Brecker next. Her LinkedIn profile came up first. Operations coordinator at a logistics company in Lexington. Married based on the name change. A profile photo that showed her looking tired in a way that had settled into her features rather than passing through them. She was 32 years old and she looked like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time without putting it down. Part of me recognized that. Part of me noted it without sympathy, and I felt guilty about the distance between those two reactions. I called her back on a Thursday evening 9 days after the voicemail. I had drafted what I wanted to say and then deleted it because scripts had a way of making hard conversations feel like performances and I had performed enough in that family. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was careful and a little stunned, like someone braced for a door to stay closed and not sure how to react when it opens a crack instead. I told her I had gotten the voicemail. I told her I wasn't calling to fight. I asked her to tell me the actual medical situation in specific terms, not the managed version from the recording but the real one. She did. It took about 10 minutes and by the end her voice had stopped being careful and had started being just tired, which I found easier to be in a conversation with. The surgery was in 2 weeks. The oncologist was considered good. The insurance had a coverage gap from Doug's recent job change that was being sorted but hadn't resolved yet, creating a secondary layer of stress on top of everything medical. Kara was driving 2 hours round trip to Lexington for every appointment because Marlene didn't want to be seen at the hospital in Harlan's Creek where everyone would find out. That detail hit me with a specific irony so sharp I had to press my lips together to keep from commenting. My mother, who had spent years managing her public image in that town with surgical precision, was now hiding her own illness from it. I filed that away without knowing yet what to do with it. I asked where Doug was in all of this. There was a pause. "You know how Dad is," Kara said. I did. Doug was the man who sat in a chair and stared at the carpet while things happened around him. "He's trying," she added, with the flatness of someone who had stopped expecting much from the verb. I asked if anyone else was helping. She said Janet, the friend who'd pushed Marlene to the screening, had been bringing meals twice a week. A friend was doing more than the husband. I noted it without saying it. Then Kara said something I hadn't expected. "I know I wasn't fair to you. Back then. I'm not saying it to get something from you right now. I'm saying it because I'm 32 years old and I've had 8 years to think about it and I am so tired of carrying it around. I let that sit in the air between us. It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't carry the full weight of something properly examined and owned out loud. But it was more than anything I had ever received from anyone in that family, and I was not going to pretend it wasn't there simply because it wasn't perfect. I told her I heard her. I told her I wasn't ready to talk about it further yet, and that what I was willing to do right now was stay on the line and think through what the next 2 weeks needed to look like practically. She exhaled in a way that had 8 years compressed inside it. We talked for another hour. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and did not try to make what I was feeling smaller or tidier than it actually was. I hadn't agreed to go back to Harlan's Creek. I hadn't agreed to anything except to keep the line open. But keeping that line open already cost me something real, and I was honest with myself about that cost without flinching from it. What I didn't know yet was that while Kara and I were having that careful, measured conversation, something was already happening on the other end in Harlan's Creek that was going to shift the shape of every decision I thought I had already made. What was happening in Harlan's Creek while Kara and I were on the phone was this. Tate had called Doug from Seoul the same evening Kara reached out to me, and during that call, which lasted nearly 2 hours according to Kara's account of it later, Tate said something to our father that nobody in that house had said out loud in 8 years. He said that if Marlene was going to get through surgery and treatment with any kind of stability, the family needed to stop pretending that losing one of its members was something that had simply happened to them rather than something they had caused. He was 20 years old when I left. He was 28 now, and apparently the distance of 8 years and 12,000 miles had given him a clarity about the Brecker family dynamics that living inside them had never allowed. Kara told me this in a follow-up call 2 days later, and her voice when she described it had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Something between relief and grief. The specific combination that arrives when someone finally says the true thing and you realize how long you've been waiting for it without knowing you were waiting. Doug apparently did not respond well in the moment. He got quiet, which was his version of resistance, and changed the subject to logistics, flights and hospital parking and whether the guest room mattress needed replacing. But Tate had said what he said and it was in the room now and the room was not the same after it. Kara told me that after the call Doug sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. She came downstairs at some point and he was still sitting there in the dark with his hands flat on the surface, staring at the middle distance the way he always did when something was working through him that he didn't have language for yet. She turned the light on and asked if he was okay. He said, "I owe your sister a real conversation." He didn't specify which sister. He meant me. I want to be honest with you about how I received all of this information because I think it matters. I didn't receive it with warmth. I received it carefully. The way you receive an unexpected structural report on a building you've been told for years was perfectly sound. You don't immediately trust it. You look for what was missed in the original inspection. You ask who is telling you this and what it costs them to say it and whether the timing is significant. The timing was significant. Marlene's surgery was 9 days away. My father's sudden clarity about owing me a real conversation had arrived precisely at the moment when the family needed maximum cooperation from all available parties. I noted this. I didn't dismiss what Tate had said or what it apparently cost him to say it, because I knew Tate and I knew it wasn't nothing. But I also knew that crisis has a way of producing epiphanies that evaporate the moment the crisis does, and I had been the recipient of exactly zero follow-through from the Brecker family for 21 years. What I did not expect was Doug calling me himself. He got my number from Kara with my permission, which I had given cautiously and specifically for logistical purposes. He called on a Sunday afternoon 4 days before Marlene's surgery. I was at Marcus's apartment when the call came in. I looked at the number, told Marcus who it was, and he said, "Take it. I'll make tea." I stepped into the hallway of his building and answered. My father's voice on the other end of the line sounded the way I expected it to sound, halting and uncomfortable in the way of someone who has rehearsed something and then abandoned the rehearsal when the real moment arrived. He said my name. Just that, just Iris, the way you say something out loud to check whether it still fits in your mouth after a long time. I said hello, Doug. I used his first name because he had forfeited Dad a long time ago and I wasn't going to hand it back as a reflex. He didn't react to it, or if he did, he kept it internal. He asked how I was doing and I said I was fine, and I waited because small talk was not why he had called and we both understood that. He was quiet for a moment and then he said something I am going to relay to you exactly as I remember it because I have replayed it enough times that I am confident in the wording. He said, "I spent 21 years watching your mother treat you differently than your sister, and I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved in how she ran the family. That was a lie I told myself because the truth was I didn't want the argument. I want you to know that I know that." He stopped there. He didn't embellish it or walk it back or pivot immediately to what he needed from me. He just let it sit. I stood in the hallway of Marcus's building for a long moment without saying anything. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a real admission from someone you had categorized as permanently evasive, and it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged and you keep reaching for the light switch where it used to be. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him it didn't fix anything, and that I needed him to understand that clearly, not as a punishment but as a fact. He said he understood. I told him I would be in contact with Kara about the surgery and that I would be reachable by phone for anything medically relevant. He said thank you. I said goodbye and went back inside and sat on Marcus's couch and stared at the ceiling for about 4 minutes while Marcus handed me a cup of tea and didn't ask me anything until I was ready to talk. The surgery was on a Tuesday. I did not go to Harlan's Creek for it. I want to be straightforward about that because I know what people expect the story to do here. The part where the prodigal daughter drives back into the small town and stands in a hospital waiting room and something cinematic happens. That is not what occurred. I stayed in Denver. I had made a clear assessment of what I was able to give at that point in the process. And showing up in a hospital waiting room in Harlan's Creek 8 years after leaving without a single conversation with Marlene herself was not something I was able to do honestly. It would have been performance and I had committed to being done with performance. What I did was stay on the phone with Kara for most of that day. She called me from the waiting room at 6:45 in the morning before they took Marlene back, and I stayed on the line through the waiting and through the surgeon coming out and through the news that the surgery had gone well and the margins were clear and the oncologist was satisfied with what they found. I heard Kara cry for the first time in 8 years, and it was the crying of someone who had been managing everything alone for so long that the release of a single piece of good news had nowhere to go except out all at once. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay because I didn't know that yet and I wasn't going to say things I couldn't stand behind. I told her she had done a good job getting through the morning. She had. Whatever else was complicated between us, she had shown up every single day for something hard and she had done it mostly alone, and that was worth saying. Marlene came through the surgery. The recovery started. Chemo was scheduled to begin 3 weeks later in short targeted cycles the oncologist considered very manageable given the staging. Kara settled into the rhythm of appointments and meal schedules and prescription pickups. Tate arrived from Seoul 10 days after the surgery and took over the driving so Kara could go back to Lexington for work during the week. Doug, to his credit and somewhat to my surprise, showed up in the ways that didn't require words. He fixed things around the house. He kept the kitchen clean. He sat with Marlene in the evenings and watched the television programs she liked without making it about himself. It was the most functional I had ever heard that household described, and the timing of it was its own kind of complicated to process. And then 3 weeks into Marlene's recovery, something arrived in my work email that I was not expecting at all. Not from the family. From somewhere else entirely. Something that was going to bring me back to Harlan's Creek whether I had planned for it or not. Through a door I never would have thought to open myself. I had spent the last several weeks operating at a careful distance, managing my involvement in the Brecker family crisis the way you manage a controlled burn, just enough engagement to keep the edges from spreading, not so much that it consumed the life I had spent 8 years building. I had been deliberate about every inch of ground I gave. But the email sitting in my inbox that Thursday afternoon was about to make deliberate a much harder word to hold on to, because what it contained had nothing to do with Marlene's recovery, and everything to do with the version of me that Harlan's Creek had been carrying around like a cautionary tale for nearly a decade. Someone in that town had finally decided to do something about it. And they hadn't asked my permission first. The email was from a woman named Ruth N. Coble. I did not recognize the name immediately, but I recognized the email domain, a small community newsletter out of Harlan's Creek called the Creek Courier that had been running in some form since before I was born. First as an actual printed sheet that got folded into church bulletins and grocery bags, and more recently as an online publication that covered local events, school board decisions, business openings, and the kind of human interest stories that small towns run on the way larger cities run on traffic reports. Ruth Ann was its editor. She had been its editor for 11 years. I found all of this out in about 4 minutes of searching after I read the first 2 sentences of her email and understood what she was asking. She was writing a piece, a profile specifically, about women from eastern Kentucky who had built careers outside the region and were doing work that connected back to their home communities in some way. She had come across my name through a regional business publication that had run a short feature on Callaway Group's expansion into a community development consulting arm that we had launched the previous year, and my bio had mentioned Harlan's Creek as my hometown. She said she had reached out to several women for the piece and was hoping I would be willing to do a brief phone interview. The email was professional, warm, and entirely routine in the way of someone who sends these requests regularly and expects a polite yes or a polite no. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Marcus with no message, just the email, and his response came back in about 6 minutes. It said, "Well, that's interesting timing." I called him. He picked up immediately. I said, "I don't know what to do with this." He said, "Yes you do." I told him I wasn't sure I wanted my name in a publication that circulated in Harlan's Creek right now, while Marlene was in recovery and the family dynamic was still unsettled and I hadn't even had a direct conversation with my mother in 8 years. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Those 2 things aren't actually connected, Iris. The article doesn't need your family's permission to exist. Neither do you." I sat with that for a while. He wasn't wrong. He rarely was, and it was genuinely irritating. I called Britt. She was characteristically more direct. "Do the interview," she said before I had finished explaining the situation. I told her I hadn't asked for her opinion yet. She said she was giving it preemptively because she knew where the conversation was going and she wanted to save us both 20 minutes. I laughed, which was the first time I had laughed in what felt like several weeks of nothing but carefully measured phone calls. Britt said, "You have spent 8 years building something real and the town you grew up in still thinks you fell apart. An interview in a local newsletter isn't revenge. It's just accurate information entering a space that's been running on inaccurate information for a long time." I didn't tell her she was right in the moment, but she was right. I responded to Ruthann Coble the following morning. I said I would be happy to participate. We scheduled a call for the following Thursday. In the 6 days between agreeing and the actual interview, I did not tell Cara about it. I thought about it and decided against it, not because I was hiding anything but because I didn't want the framing of my participation to become about the family before the conversation had even happened. The article was not about the Bruckers. It was about me and my work, and those were the terms on which I intended to engage with it. The interview itself lasted 40 minutes. Ruthann was good at her job in the specific way of someone who has been doing local journalism long enough to understand that the most interesting part of any story is usually the thing the person almost doesn't say. She asked about my career trajectory, about how Callaway Group's community development work connected to my own background, about what it meant to have grown up in a small town and then built a professional life in a city with a fundamentally different pace and scale. I answered all of it honestly and without performance. I told her that growing up in a community like Harlan's Creek gave you a particular understanding of how interconnected things were, how a single closed business or a single family in crisis sent ripples through a neighborhood in ways that a city absorbs and diffuses but a small town holds and carries. I told her that the work I did now was partly informed by knowing firsthand what it looked like when a community took care of its own members and what it looked like when it didn't. Ruthann paused at that last sentence. She asked me to say more about what I meant. I chose my words carefully. I said that small towns were very good at constructing narratives about their residents, and that those narratives could be sustaining or they could be limiting, and that the most useful thing a community could do was remain curious about whether the story they were telling about someone was actually still true. She asked if I was speaking from personal experience. I said I was. She didn't push further, which told me she was a good journalist, and she asked instead about the specifics of our community development work and the methodology behind it. The article ran 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning. Ruthann had sent me the draft for fact-checking 2 days before publication, which was courteous, and the piece was fair and accurate and in several places genuinely well written. It featured 3 women, myself included. The headline was something clean and unadorned about Eastern Kentucky women redefining regional impact from outside the region. My section was 6 paragraphs. It included my title, a summary of Callaway Group's community work, a photograph I had sent from my company headshot file, and that last quote about communities remaining curious about whether the stories they told about their members were still true. Kara called me at 9:17 that morning. I knew before I answered that she had seen it. Her voice had the particular quality of someone standing in the middle of something they hadn't fully processed yet. "Iris," she said. "It's everywhere. I mean, it's not everywhere, it's Harlan's Creek, but in Harlan's Creek that's the same thing." I asked what she meant by everywhere. She said Janet had texted Marlene a link to the article before 8 in the morning. She said their neighbor Mrs. Perkins had called the house phone before 9. She said her own mother-in-law in Lexington had seen it shared in a Kentucky women's professional group on Facebook and sent it to Kara without knowing the connection. I let Kara talk herself through it without interrupting because she needed to and because I was processing my own version of the same information at the same time. Then Kara said, "Mom, read it." I waited. She didn't say anything to me directly. But I came into the kitchen and she had her tablet on the table and the article was open on the screen and she was just sitting there with her hands in her lap. I asked what expression she had. Kara thought about it for a moment. "Not angry. I expected angry. It was more like," she paused, searching for the right word, "like she was reading something she already knew the ending of and was only now understanding the middle." I didn't respond to that. I tucked it away and let it do whatever it needed to do inside me on its own time. What Kara told me next was the part one hadn't anticipated. She said that Doug had read the article too, and that he had walked into the kitchen where Marlene was sitting with the tablet and he had said out loud in front of Janet, who had stopped by with groceries that morning, "Our daughter built all of that from nothing while we were here telling ourselves she was the problem." Janet had apparently gone very still. Marlene had not responded. Doug had poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and drunk it in silence. Kara said the kitchen had been quiet for a very long time after that. I asked Kara how she felt about all of it. She said, "Honestly, I feel like a window opened in a house that's been closed up for 8 years." I understood that exactly. I also understood that open windows let in weather along with air, and that what came next between me and the Brecker family was going to require more than a newspaper profile and a kitchen conversation to determine. But something had shifted in the architecture of the situation. The story Harlan's Creek had been holding about Iris Brecker had been quietly and publicly updated, not by a confrontation, not by a dramatic return, but by 6 paragraphs in a local newsletter and a quote about communities and the stories they tell. Marlene called me for the first time in 8 years 4 days after the article ran. I let it ring. She left a voicemail. It was 47 seconds long. I listened to it once and then I sat very still for a long time, because what she said in those 47 seconds was something I had been waiting for since I was 21 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a folder of loan paperwork in my hands. And it changed exactly nothing and everything at the same time. I had not planned to go back to Harlan's Creek. I had not planned any of what the last several weeks had produced. I had answered one phone call, stayed on one line, done one interview, and the ground had shifted under a town that had kept a false version of me propped up for 8 years like a scarecrow in a field nobody was farming anymore. Marlene's voicemail was 47 seconds long and I have never once been tempted to delete it. Not because it was everything I needed it to be. It wasn't. It was imperfect in the specific way of a person who has spent their entire life being certain about everything suddenly being uncertain about one thing and not knowing how to sound while they're in it. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. Not softer exactly. Just smaller. The particular smallness of someone operating without their usual audience. She said my name first. Then she said she had read the article. She said the work sounded important and that she could tell I had worked hard. She paused long enough that I thought the voicemail had cut off and then she said, "I didn't handle things well with you. I know that. I've known it for longer than I've been willing to say it." Another pause. "I'm not asking you to call me back. I just wanted you to hear that from me directly. Before any more time goes by." And then she hung up. 47 seconds. 8 years. I sat on my kitchen floor after I listened to it, back against the cabinet, phone in my lap, looking at the ceiling the way you look at something when you're trying to understand its geometry. It was not a complete apology. It didn't name specific things or account for specific damage. But it was the first time in my life that Marlene Brecker had said out loud, without an audience, that she had been wrong about something involving me. And I was not going to flatten that into either more or less than what it actually was. I called Marcus. He answered immediately and I read him the voicemail from memory because I had already memorized it without meaning to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do. Just what do you want?" I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was a valid place to be and to stay there as long as I needed to. Then he asked if I wanted him to come over. I said yes. He was at my door in 20 minutes with food and without advice, which is exactly the right combination to bring to a situation like that one. I took 4 days before I did anything. On the 5th day I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote Marlene a letter. Not an email. A letter by hand on actual paper because what I needed to say deserved the deliberateness of something that required more effort than typing. It took 3 drafts. The first was too long and too angry. The second was too managed and said almost nothing real. The third was 1 page and it was right. It said I had heard her message and appreciated what she said. It said that 8 years had cost something real on my end and I needed her to understand that without me itemizing everything on the bill. It said I was not ready to rebuild anything yet and didn't know if I ever would be, and that I was being honest about that rather than making a promise I couldn't keep. At the end it said I was glad she was through the surgery and hoped the rest of her treatment went the way the doctors expected. I sealed it and mailed it to the Birchwood Lane address I still knew by memory. Kara called me the week after the letter arrived. Marlene had shown it to her, which I had anticipated. Kara said she had read it at the kitchen table and then folded it back up and put it in her cardigan pocket and had been carrying it around for 3 days. I didn't respond to that. Kara asked if it meant things were going to change between me and Marlene. I told her I didn't know and that I wasn't going to manufacture a timeline for something that would either happen honestly or not happen at all. What I had not accounted for was Tate. He called on a Saturday morning from his own number, direct, no preamble. He said, I knew something was wrong when we were growing up and I was too young and then too checked out to do anything about it and I think about that. I told him he was 12 when I left and that 12-year-olds were not responsible for adult dynamics. He said he understood that rationally and that it didn't stop him from feeling it anyway. I told him I knew exactly what he meant. We talked for an hour and a half, mostly about things entirely removed from Harlan's Creek, his work, my work, Denver, Soul, what it felt like to build something in a place disconnected from where you started. He had a precise, dry humor that caught me off guard more than once. By the end of the call I understood that my brother had become someone I genuinely wanted to know. The wanting of it was tender the way newly healed things are tender when you first put weight on them. 6 weeks after the letter, Kara asked me if I would consider coming to Harlan's Creek. No constructed occasion, no forced reunion. She was going for a weekend in late April to help sort through things at the house and spend time with Tate before he flew back to Seoul. She said there was no pressure and no agenda and no expectation beyond whatever I was willing to give. I sat with it for 5 days. Then I said yes. I drove rather than flew. 14 hours from Denver through Kansas and Missouri and into Kentucky, which is a long time to be alone with your thoughts, and I needed every mile of it. I pulled onto Birchwood Lane on a Friday evening in late April when the light was doing that particular golden thing that late spring does in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, turning everything it touches into something that looks slightly more significant than it is. The yellow house looked the same. The porch step was still broken. There were new curtains in the front window. Kara's car was in the driveway. So was Tate's rental. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside. Not from fear exactly. More from the need to mark the moment accurately before it became something else. I had left this house at 21 with a bag and $340 and a decision I held for 8 years. I was coming back at 29 as someone who had built a career, a home, a relationship, and a life shaped like who I actually was. Those were not the same person and I wasn't going to walk through that door before acknowledging the distance between them. Marlene was in the living room. She had lost weight during treatment and her hair was growing back fine and close. She looked smaller than the woman I had been carrying in my memory. She looked like a person, which sounds like a simple thing and is actually the most complicated part of this entire story. She stood when she saw me and didn't reach for me immediately. She just looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for and said, "You look like you're doing well." I said, "I am." Kara was in the kitchen doorway. Tate was near the stairs. Doug came in from the back and stopped when he saw me and nodded once. The nod of a man who understood that words were not going to be adequate but was going to show up anyway. We had dinner at the kitchen table, the 5 of us, for the first time in 8 years. Nobody performed anything. Kara cooked. Tate argued with Doug about something on television. Marlene asked me a question about Denver and listened to my answer with her full attention in a way I didn't remember from childhood. It was not a healed family. It was a damaged one choosing for one evening to be in the same room without pretending the damage wasn't there. That is a different thing, and it is not a small one. I stayed 2 days and drove back to Denver on Sunday with the windows down and the radio off because I needed the quiet. I still don't know entirely what comes next. The door on Birchwood Lane is not closed and not wide open. It is something more honest than either. Slightly ajar, held there by two people finally being truthful about what they can and cannot give, which is harder than slamming it shut and harder than flinging it open, and somewhere in that difficulty is the only version of this I trust. My name is Iris Brecker. I am 29 years old. I left Harlan's Creek with $340 and 8 years later I came back on my own terms through a door I chose to open at a pace nobody rushed. If you have been the person your family wrote off, if you have been somewhere building something real while someone back home was telling a smaller story about you, the story they tell is not the one that counts. The one that counts is the one you are living. And you do not owe anyone access to it until they have earned the right to read it honestly. That is the whole of it. Thank you for staying until the end. I think about Harlan's Creek differently now than I did when I was 21. I used to think of it as the place that failed me, and that framing was accurate but incomplete. It is also the place that made me precise about what I needed, relentless about building it, and completely intolerant of accepting less than honest treatment from the people in my life. Those qualities did not come from Denver. They were forged in a yellow house on a street where a porch step never got fixed and a daughter kept being told she was difficult for simply asking to be treated fairly. The town that tried to write me off gave me everything I needed to make that story untrue. I don't know if that is irony or just the way things work. But I have stopped being angry about it long enough to notice that I am grateful for the version of myself it produced. And that is something I never expected to be able to say. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told. And here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.